Okay, well, hello. I just want to start by saying I'm really grateful to be a part of this workshop. So thank you to all the amazing people who have been sort of working behind the scenes to make the workshop possible. To introduce myself, my name is Susan Kennedy, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Santa Clara University, and I work on the ethics of technology. And before this, I was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Embedded Ethics Program, where basically we work to incorporate ethics into the computer science curriculum. So that's where I got to meet some of the other speakers that you've heard from this week, like BJ and Brian, and have the opportunity to work with them to embed some responsible AI content into the TinyML edX courses. So I have to say, I am really excited to talk to you about responsible AI today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So I always think it's great to see ethics being covered alongside the technical content in a workshop like this. And I think that's because the work that you're doing is not just figuring out what's technically possible or even legally permissible. In other words, it's not figuring out what you can do, but also involves thinking carefully and critically about what you can or should do. So by the end of this talk, I want to cover the what and the how and the why of ethics and responsible AI. In particular, I'm hoping you'll gain some more perspective about why ethical reasoning is valuable, learn more about what ethics can do for you or provide you with as you work with TinyML, and finally provide you with some ideas and tools that can help you figure out how to incorporate ethics into your work. So just to give you a sense of sort of what does ethics look like in practice. Now, that's a tall order to fill in an hour-long presentation, but I'm hoping this will at least be a point that inspires you to continue thinking about the role of ethics in your work. So I'd like to start today with a quote from Nick Bostrom. He's a philosopher at the University of Oxford, and he says, "Machine intelligence is the last invention that humanity will ever need to make." I mean, that's a pretty bold claim, right? I love this quote because I think it captures just how epic AI is. So if you're relatively new to the field, or if you're like me, where computer science isn't your primary field, you might even think AI is like magic. And yet what makes AI so special is that it's not just for tech people, it's for helping doctors and farmers and families and athletes and industry, pretty much everyone everywhere. So it really has enormous potential to do good. So what's not to love? And I shouldn't just say potential, because it's also a reality. People are explicitly aiming to use AI to solve some of the world's most pressing problems, a trend in the AI community called AI for social good. So what kinds of problems, you might ask? Well, the United Nations Sustainable Agenda for 2030 has 17 goals like ending poverty, world hunger, improving health and education, reducing inequality and injustice, and so on. And the existing AI capabilities can be used in some way for every one of these goals. And over the past few days, you've been learning about all of the really promising applications of tiny machine learning specifically, because as it turns out, it has some really unique features that opens up new domains and new ideas. For instance, with battery-powered on-device computing without Wi-Fi connection means we can use machine learning in areas that doesn't have hardwired electricity lines. Its low latency means we can use ML in cases where instant results are of the utmost importance. So tiny machine learning can be used in industry for predictive maintenance, monitoring turbines. It can be used in agriculture, as you got to learn more about yesterday with the cotton leaf anomaly detection in cattle, or and farmland pest detection with UAVs and foot and mouth disease detection in cattle. It can also be used for wildlife conservation, like wildfire detection, or using sensors to prevent elephant collisions on the railways in India, and the anti-poaching device to protect the diverse species of animals in Ethiopia that you'll learn more about later today. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do with tiny machine learning. So before I get carried away, the important point is this: tiny machine learning empowers us to create solutions in the world that we care about. But as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. And this certainly holds true for AI. It has great power to do good, but it can also cause harm, even if entirely unintended. So just as we've seen the promises and benefits of AI, we've also been confronted with some pretty notable AI failures. And when I say AI failures, I just don't mean the sort of, oh, it didn't work, or the underwhelming kind of issues. I'm talking about some of the ugly stuff, like when AI resulted in unfair or biased or discriminatory or even harmful outcomes. So let's consider a few cases that made headlines in recent years. One, we have Microsoft that created the chatbot Tay. And after learning from data on social media and the platform Twitter, she quickly began writing racist and offensive content. In 2018, Amazon had to scrap its hiring algorithm because of gender bias. So it penalized resumes that included words like women's, such as women's chess club captain or all women's college. There was an algorithm that was developed to predict recidivism rates and help judges set bail, but it turned out to incorrectly label Black defendants as high risk twice as often as white defendants. And in 2019, users were shocked to discover hidden microphones in their Nest smart home devices. Google said it was an error. It was just a form of future-proofing the device so that they could update it with more capabilities later down the line. Now, I think it's safe to assume that the people creating this AI did not intend these consequences, but nevertheless, AI resulted in some rather serious ethical concerns. The thing is, when we discover these challenges only after widespread deployment, this forces us to implement Band-Aid type solutions. So Microsoft had to take Tay offline within hours, and Google had to own up to the failure and engage in damage control. So waiting until the damage is done might seem like a little too late. And if you feel this way, then you're in good company. A Pew Research poll showed that the majority of Americans believe that tech companies often fail to anticipate how their products and services will impact society. And the Global Risk Report from the World Economic Forum in 2018 lists adverse consequences of technological advances as one of the top risks that societies around the world are facing today. So the question is, how can we do better? How can we make sure that the AI we build doesn't cause harm and benefits everyone the way that we intend it to? Well, the most important thing is being proactive about ethical concerns rather than reactive. So instead of viewing ethics as something that you consider at the end of the project or after disaster strikes, the goal is to embed ethical reasoning throughout the entire workflow. Because as it turns out, each stage of the development presents unique challenges, but depending on how you look at it, it also presents unique opportunities to consider what we should be doing. So in the design phase, for instance, we can ask questions like, what am I building? What's the goal or the problem that I'm trying to solve? Is AI the best solution for this? Who am I building this for? And how should I collect data? In the development phase, when you're training a model, evaluating and optimizing it, you'll run into questions like how to mitigate bias or how to ensure the model is fair. In deployment, you might consider questions about how to preserve privacy for the data that's coming in or how to address security issues. But there's another phase of the workflow involving post-deployment and the iterative process. So that's why we see this arrow that's pointing from the end of the cycle all the way back to the beginning. So here you might encounter issues like model drift and figuring out at what point does a drop in performance require us to retrain the model. Or you might think about issues of sustainability because you might not be worried about energy uses when you're working just towards proof of concept, especially since one of the unique advantages of TinyML is its low power operation. But once you're scaling up to thousands of devices, whether your TinyML solution is sustainable does become an important issue. So working through the ethical dimensions of your work can be a somewhat messy process and one that doesn't always have a clear solution. Sometimes we'll run into trade-offs where we have to make a less than ideal decision to prioritize one value over another. And so it might feel a little discouraging at first to wade into the world of responsible AI, and that's to be expected, I think. Really, the goal is just to be striving to identify ethical considerations that might arise at whatever stage of the workflow, and having some tools to think through these questions and inform your choices going forward. Because I think what I've found is that the people who are working on bleeding edge technologies like TinyML are exceptionally passionate about their work, and they're a force for change that they'd like to see in the world. And only rarely are the ethical concerns surrounding a technology a matter of bad intentions. Instead, it's just a matter of not being able to identify the challenge at an early stage and have the opportunity to tackle it head on. So for today's presentation, my hope is that you'll start reflecting on some issues you might not have considered before, and in your work, you'll be able to match your ambition and good intentions with some concrete steps towards building TinyML responsibly. And for the remaining time, we're just going to look at some examples of responsible AI considerations at each stage of the workflow to really get a sense of what identifying and addressing ethical challenges looks like in practice. So starting with the first stage, design, which I take to mean the very beginning of the project, where you're conceptualizing your AI solution, we of course need to identify the problem and whether AI is the right solution. Just because we can build AI doesn't mean we should, or that it's the right solution. But let's suppose you've thought carefully about all of this. We know what our goal is and that AI is going to be a valuable solution. During this phase, we also want to think about these other questions like, who is it for? Who else might it impact? And how can we make sure that AI is aligned with human values? So these are the questions that we'll turn to now. When we start thinking about the impact AI will have, it can be really helpful to conduct a stakeholder analysis. So stakeholders are the people who are going to be impacted by a proposed piece of technology. There's going to be the direct stakeholders, who are the people who would directly interact with your technology. And this is what we typically think of in terms of the user. But your technology will also likely have indirect stakeholders. So these people might not be users, but they're nonetheless impacted by the technology. For example, the passenger of a self-driving car might be considered a direct stakeholder, while nearby pedestrians on the street would be considered the indirect stakeholders, because suppose the car malfunctions and swerves off the road, they could be impacted. And indirect stakeholders, we're not even just thinking of individuals, they could also be communities, organizations, and so on. So let's turn to an example of an image classifier for disease diagnosis, like diabetic retinopathy, for instance. We can try mapping the stakeholders and identifying relevant moral considerations and values they have so that we can sort of understand our users a bit better and the social impact our AI device will have more generally. So by conducting a stakeholder analysis, it makes it easier to see how AI might bolster some values and hinder others, or maybe even create a conflict between them. So let's suppose that the doctor values the accuracy of this technology so they can deliver the best care for their patients. And they also care about whether they'll need additional training to utilize the device, how easy it'll be to incorporate in their day-to-day workflow, and whether it will allow for advances to be made in medical research. The patient, on the other hand, maybe values a personal level of care, being fully informed about their diagnosis, being able to trust their doctor, and ensuring that their privacy is protected. So we've identified our stakeholder values, but you probably noticed that the values for the doctor look very different from those of the patient. And this is important because it helps us identify where potential value tensions might arise. For example, the doctor might want the most accurate AI available, but it's possible that the algorithm's decision-making process might be opaque in such a way that the doctor can't fully explain how it arrived at a certain diagnosis. And this might interfere with the patient's desire to be fully informed, or their ability to trust that their doctor is making the right decision about their diagnosis. So look, we've already gained some valuable insights, which means we can start coming up with design specifications concerning what level explainability is needed to keep our AI aligned with human values. And just to look at one other example, we might suppose that the doctor values advances in medical research that would be made possible by the AI's collection of data, but this collection of data might conflict with the patient's desire for privacy. So sometimes we're going to be confronted with hard questions or trade-offs that'll take some work to sort out a good compromise. But the bigger takeaway is that if we're just focused on the user, we could easily miss these things. So conducting a stakeholder analysis and including people that are both directly and indirectly affected helps us identify problems we might not have seen otherwise. Now, identifying potential values, tensions, or harms has clear connections to decisions you'll make as a designer later on. For example, what counts as accuracy needed for AI to be a valuable solution? Is a false positive or a false negative worse? This informs how you'll optimize the model. For instance, should you prioritize precision or recall? And you can use the stakeholder analysis here as well to determine what kinds of harms are associated with each type of error. So if we were talking about diagnosis of eye disease, for instance, you might want to avoid false negatives because the goal is to catch cases of disease, and it'd be better to send someone for further testing than send them home with a clean bill of health when something's actually wrong. But if we were talking about a personal voice assistant, maybe false negatives are actually fine because the users only face a minor inconvenience in having to repeat a command. And it's really the false positives that causes issues because it might lead the device to start recording and raise privacy concerns for users. So the moral of the story is context matters. One size doesn't fit all, and the particular context or device you're working on might change how users prioritize values and what factors might impact adoption of it later on. So a stakeholder analysis is a great tool for thinking about who will be impacted, what values they have, what moral considerations might be raised, and it sets you up for thinking about how to collect data. So now we're going to move on to responsible AI at the development stage. Suppose you found a problem befitting of an AI solution. You're starting to collect data and train your model. How can you make sure you build the model in a way that works the way we intend? Well, one key problem is worth discussing is how to mitigate bias and ensure that your model is fair. So one of the promises of machine learning is that it could potentially offer a superior alternative to human decision-making. It can be more accurate, more reliable, and maybe less subjective. On the flip side, there's a problem of bias, which is especially concerning because it can not only lead to inaccurate results, or even worse yet, discriminatory ones. So data is the bread and butter of machine learning. So if there's something wrong with the data, you might end up with bad outcomes, no matter how hard you try to create an otherwise perfect model. This is known as the garbage in, garbage out problem. But data can be quote unquote garbage for a couple of different reasons, right? It can enter because of human error, because the data inaccurately reflects the world, or the data accurately reflects a problematic world. So we might end up recreating or automating problematic inequalities that we'd rather avoid. So one way that bias enters the picture is owing to how we define the target variable. So this basically gives our model an objective, but it can sometimes be a rather subjective matter, making it more of an art form rather than a perfect science. For example, if we're designing an algorithm to make promotion recommendations, how would you define a good employee? And how can you put this in terms that the computer could understand? Well, you'd have to come up with some kind of quantifiable measures, maybe the number of sick days, number of times late to work, the number of sales per quarter, length of employment. But defining the target variable this way might unintentionally disadvantage some class of people. So maybe if you focus on the number of sick days, you might disadvantage pregnant women or individuals with disabilities missing work. Or if you focus on the number of times late to work, that might disadvantage people who rely on public transportation. So how might this apply to a case of TinyML? Well, imagine you're using a biometric sensor for a health wearable device. How would you define healthy? Maybe you could focus on heart rate or blood pressure, the number of steps. And while these might all seem like really innocuous measures, focusing on blood pressure might disadvantage the elderly who tend to have higher blood pressure even when they have heart healthy habits. Another way bias enters the picture is through the labeling of data. So the reason is that the labels we apply to the training data have to serve as the ground truth. So as far as our model can tell, the labels perfectly match reality. But what happens when there's mislabeled data? For example, if we build a horse versus human classifier and some of the images of horses are actually mislabeled as human. Even if it's obvious to us that the picture is of a horse, the computer only knows what's in the picture based off the label. And so the model might start to misclassify images of horses as human. And while this might seem easy to spot with a careful review of the data, bias and labeling can sometimes be much more difficult to address. So suppose we're labeling medical images for a disease classifier. And we present a set of patient images to trained graders who label it. While the two extremes might show a clear pattern, if we look at this graph in the part that's highlighted with the black box, you might see that there's some disagreement among the experts about which label best applies to a particular image. So in which case we have to make a rather controversial decision about how to label these images and train our model. There's another type of bias that might occur when there's prejudice that's reflected in the data. For example, maybe there's a stereotype that women are primarily responsible for cooking and other household chores. And this leads to women being overrepresented in a data set that includes images of people cooking. This could cause the algorithm to be inaccurate by predicting that women are cooking a majority of the time, even when this isn't actually the case. And lastly, second to last, we can talk about bias with measurement distortion. This most often occurs when there's a problem with the device making a measurement or an observation. So to put it simply, hardware matters. This can happen when the device used to collect data for training differs from the device that's used when the model is deployed. So if our data set contains images taken from a DSLR camera, but the device our model is being deployed on is a mobile phone, as these images would show the difference between the value distortion might cause the model to generate bad results. And the last case of bias I'll cover is sampling bias. This is a case where the data is incomplete or otherwise inaccurately reflects the users. So if the data set doesn't fully represent the diversity of end users, this can lead the model to be less accurate for those individuals or groups. For example, researchers have shown that voice recognition tools, for instance, struggle to identify slang versus formal diction, non-native English speakers, individuals with speech impairments. So sometimes sampling bias is a matter inherent to our method of data collection. You might consider an example called street bump. In this case, the data was collected from product users, and the point of the app was basically to identify and report potholes that required repair. But since the app was deployed on smartphones whose users tend to be young and with a higher income, the data ultimately didn't reflect the number of potholes in poorer neighborhoods or those with elderly residents. Now, as Kate Crawford, who's a principal researcher at Microsoft and a professor at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering, says, we need to ask which people are excluded, which places are less visible, what happens if you live in the shadow of big data sets. So I think what this quote captures is sometimes we are responsible for trying to think about those things where we don't know. So we have to know the things we don't know. And that's like kind of paradoxical. So it can be really difficult to overcome something like sampling bias because you really need to have a strong understanding of what the data set should look like ultimately and who should be included. But I think there's some optimism to be called for here. So for instance, after recognizing the importance of making their products accessible to everyone, Google launched Project Euphonia in 2019 with the goal of collecting more data from individuals with speech impairments or heavy accents to essentially fill in those gaps in the current voice data sets. And it's also especially inspiring to see the crowdsourcing movement by Mozilla Common Voice. With a breakdown of demographics, this information is practically useful for people who are intending to use the data set. It makes it clear where the data set could be improved. And by building this open source data set and striving for better representation, they're creating a great resource for anyone to use. Now, when we're talking about bias and data sets, one thing that is really important is simply transparency about what's included in a data set. So one solution that's come up in industry is called data sheets for data sets. And it was a published paper by researchers from Google and Microsoft, as well as academics. They offer a list of questions for dataset creators to reflect on during the key stages of the dataset lifecycle. For example, the motivation, the composition, collection, process, how they label it, the uses, the distribution and maintenance of the dataset. All of these things are really important and useful if you're trying to share a dataset, so people can use it responsibly and keep an eye out for things like bias and whether it's a good fit for the project that they're working on. Similarly, nutrition labels were an idea that was proposed. Here, the idea essentially looks like the nutrition label you'd see on the back of a cereal box, for instance, and it highlights the sort of key ingredients of a data set, including the provenance or metadata, missing units. And this helps someone at a glance get a better sense of what the data contains and make more informed decisions about whether it's an appropriate data set for their project. But even with these measures, bias remains a really hard problem to tackle, and there's a lot of obstacles to collecting strong representative data sets. And so that's why I want to shift gears and talk about fairness, which is one of the problems you might run into when you have a biased data set. And while this topic is still a live area of research and debate for ethicists and computer scientists, I think a general way to understand fairness in machine learning is a model that exhibits discriminatory biases, perpetuates inequality, or performs less well for historically disadvantaged groups. But one thing is it's important to sort of realize how discriminate as a word can be used in different ways. Technically speaking, all machine learning discriminates, since that might just mean to recognize a distinction or a difference. But when we're talking about fairness, what we're concerned with here is wrongful discrimination. So wrongful discrimination typically involves disadvantaging people in protected classes based on characteristics that you can see listed here, like age, disability status, medical history, sex, race, and so forth. So let's take a look at just two different metrics of fairness to get an understanding of what it might look like to try and optimize a model for this. One metric is called group unawareness, where basically sensitive attributes like race or gender aren't included as features of the data. And a benefit of this metric is that it avoids using these sensitive attributes, so it won't be making decisions differentiated on that basis. For instance, like Amazon's algorithm that sorted women's job applications into a different pile than men's. But a disadvantage is that there might be highly correlated features that serves as a proxy for the sensitive attribute. So you might have a model that ends up producing discriminatory results anyway. And we can contrast group unawareness with something like equal accuracy, where the percentage of correct classifications, in this case is whether someone's actually healthy or not, should be the same for all individuals. And this is just referred to as the overall accuracy of the model. But a problem that might arise is that even when the accuracy rate is equal for group A and group B, the errors that end up occurring might be different for each. So for example, group A might have a higher rate of false negatives, while group B has a higher rate of false positives. And one real life example of this is Northpoint's tool for predicting recidivism rates that was being used in a criminal justice system. What ended up happening was that despite equal accuracy across different demographic groups, the Black defendants had a higher rate of false positives, while white defendants had a higher rate of false negatives. So when the model's results inform decisions, the distribution of some benefit or harm, differences between a false negative and a false positive can make a really big difference. So how can you ensure that your model is fair in practice? Well, fortunately, there's been some really cool tools that are available to use. One of these is IBM's AI Fairness 360 tool that makes bias testing a part of your development cycle. And similar tools are offered by Google. And for instance, the What If tool, and you can find a collab to experiment with the DNN trained on census data for predicting loans on the TinyMLX GitHub page. Now shifting into deployment. Our goal is to see how ethical considerations concerning privacy can give rise to design specifications. So when it comes to privacy, there's really a huge benefit to working with tiny machine learning. On-device machine learning allows you to process sensitive data locally, and by harnessing the power of edge computing, where data is being processed at the source, well, this decreases latency, but more importantly, it minimizes the transmissions of data up to the cloud, which would otherwise create room for potential privacy violations. So with edge computing, there's going to be less opportunities for malicious actors to intercept the data being transmitted. And since the data is being primarily stored on the device, it's more secure than if it were warehoused in a singular location like the cloud. So these features of tiny machine learning are definitely a step forward in the right direction, but I think there's still a long way to go when it comes to adequately protecting privacy. And you think, why is that the case? Well, tiny machine learning is going to contribute to an exploding number of IoT devices, which means that we're just going to be collecting more and more data. And this matters because even seemingly innocuous data, like the time a coffee machine is turned on, can reveal deeply intimate aspects of a person's life when you integrate or aggregate that with other information. So there's a lot of different steps we can take to preserve privacy. But before jumping into solutions, we want to start with a clear understanding of why privacy is valuable and figuring out what constitutes a privacy violation. So one of the first things that probably comes to mind is preventing bad actors from gaining access to data. In cases like this, privacy is closely connected to security concerns. For example, if a hacker gains inappropriate access to someone's passwords or characteristics or whereabouts, in a data breach, they could potentially use this information to cause harm. And while tiny machine learning reduces some opportunities for hackers, it's still a real possibility. But aside from that, why else might we be concerned about privacy? Sometimes it's just because our data and information is nobody else's business. And so there's inappropriate transfers of personal data across boundaries of a given context. For example, we think it's fine if a medical professional asks about our health status, but if a potential employer has access to this information, you might be discriminated against or disadvantaged in some way. So you want to give careful consideration to things like the context your device will be deployed in, and what type of information you'll be collecting, who has access to it. Now, according to Helen Nistenbaum, privacy is a right to an appropriate flow of personal information. And here, what's considered appropriate hinges on the context. So If a new technology or practice preserves this notion of this appropriate flow of information, then it preserves what she calls contextual integrity. But if a technology changes this flow of information, then it violates it and potentially violates our right to privacy. Now, once we describe the informational norms of the context, we can compare it to what changes might take place if we introduce some new kind of technology. In essence, we can use contextual integrity as like a decision heuristic, comparing the context before and after the implementation of some new device. And if it's the case that the technology results in any changes along these axes, perhaps by expanding the number of actors, by introducing some new person who will be privy to and receive the data, then the technology is going to be flagged as violating privacy. But it turns out that technology oftentimes does result in some changes to informational norms of a context. And change isn't always a bad thing. So even though a process is flagged for violating contextual integrity, it might be considered ethically permissible, and so something that we ultimately want to implement if it changes the current practice for the better. So in order to figure out if a new technology is an acceptable form of progress or change rather than a problematic or objectionable one, we'll want to consider some ethical questions like these. Does the practice provide better support for contextual values? Does it promote people's autonomy, or does it improve power relations? Does it create a fair distribution of burdens and benefits? So by asking these kinds of questions, we're not just guessing about whether a new technology is good. We can use these ethical questions as tools to sort of help us structure the problem at hand. So just to go through an example to show you how this might work, suppose you've been working with machine learning for activity detection, where one potentially beneficial application of this kind of technology would be to detect falls in the elderly. So instead of requiring an individual to wear a sensor or relying on constant remote surveillance, we can have a video surveillance that's always on, monitoring the individual in case they fall down. And if a fall is detected, a caregiver can be notified to check in on them and offer assistance. So let's talk about Kepler Night Nurse as an example. Does it maintain privacy? Well, it seems to raise a red flag, at least initially, since it introduces new actors. Instead of this information just being between the patient and the caregiver, now we have annotators at Kepler involved who are reviewing the data to improve the algorithm. So then we can ask, well, is this a change in contextual integrity that's ultimately justified? So we ask those kinds of ethical questions. Does it promote contextual values? Well, having this kind of technology does seem to improve the care and safety and health of the patient. It seems to promote autonomy now that the elderly can live independently, as opposed to maybe moving into a nursing home or with relatives where they'd be under constant surveillance from caregivers. And when it comes to the fair distribution of burdens and benefits, you might think, yeah, the individual has to have the burden of the surveillance, but they also directly benefit. So ultimately, while the annotators at Kepler are a new person involved who might be seeing this data and annotating it, ultimately, when you ask some of these ethical questions and reflect on it, it seems like it's a great technology to have. So once we have a handle on why privacy is valuable, what constitutes a violation of it, we can translate this into decisions about design specifications. So what can we do? And more importantly, what should we do to protect privacy? Now, one thing is minimizing the data that's transmitted and stored. In essence, don't collect the data that you don't need and set up a timeline for maybe deleting the data periodically. After all, you wouldn't have to worry about others gaining inappropriate access to data if you don't have that data. But another reason it's important to minimize data handling wherever possible is that government pressure can sometimes force you to hand over information. So while there's some cases where this is for the greater good, there's a possibility that governments could abuse this power and end up harming your users. Second step is maybe protecting the information that you do have. So even if you remove personal identifiers like name and address, the safest thing to do is treat all data as if it's personal data and protect it with encryption techniques. But since privacy is about more than just preventing hackers from gaining access, you'll want to map out clearly how data and personal information flows, just like we were doing before. So be specific about what you're collecting, who's going to have access, and whether or not that information is crossing boundaries from one context to another. And lastly, you want to obtain informed consent, which requires being transparent with the users about how their data is being collected and used so that they can make an informed decision about their involvement. And if you've done a good job of minimizing, you should be able to effectively communicate to users why your product's benefits are worth the privacy implications. And since each device raises a unique set of privacy concerns, there isn't a privacy checklist, so to speak, that'll work across all cases. And I think this is a theme that really holds true for all of these ethical challenges. Even if we're talking about keyword spotting applications, the ethical considerations are going to depend on the device itself, the context. And so what you should really be aiming for is thinking or having this ability to just identify and think through some of these ethical challenges that might arise. And the last stage of the workflow that we'll talk about is what happens after deployment when you start looking to scale your model to potentially hundreds or thousands of devices. So just to provide a brief overview of some of the basics of microcontrollers and how these might compare to microprocessors, one important difference is that MCUs consume significantly less power than a microprocessor. So a typical MCU draws power in the order of milliwatts or microwatts, which is 1,000 times less power consumption than a microprocessor. And it's because of this energy efficiency that TinyML devices can run on battery power for weeks or months, even years, while running machine learning applications at the edge. But microcontrollers in themselves are not new. I think there's estimated 250 billion microcontrollers in use today. And now with tiny machine learning, that's expected to become even more pervasive. So while we might not ordinarily think about computing resources when we're working with a single device, when we're faced with the possibility of scaling out TinyML, an important consideration to keep in mind is that the production and maintenance of a large quantity of MCUs can lead to substantial carbon emissions. So we'll address some sustainability issues, which is focused on data sources, power supplies, and infrastructure as a way of measuring and reducing the carbon footprint from manufacturing hardware to training and running an ML application. And when we're addressing the environmental impact of machine learning, there's like two different ways to categorize the costs. So the first one is like the environmental cost that typically comes to mind when people think of carbon emissions. It's the operational or recurring costs associated with product use. For example, energy consumption required for training and running inference on an ML device. But there's a second kind of environmental cost that's often overlooked, and that's the capital costs of machine learning. These are the one-time activities like the manufacturing and production of MCUs or the supply chain underlying this, as well as the end-of-life processing. So if you have thousands of machine learning devices that run on battery power, end-of-life processing refers to the cost of properly disposing of these batteries so that they don't end up in landfills. And interestingly, recent research has shown that the carbon footprint from machine learning operations is diminishing thanks to advancements in system energy efficiency and the increasing use of renewable energy sources. But the capital costs remain high, and so more efforts to create sustainable supply chain activities are needed. But while quantifying the environmental impact of machine learning in terms of operational and capital costs is helpful, it might not be immediately obvious how to factor these costs into one's decisions. So that's why it's important to reflect on what the ultimate goal is. In other words, what does sustainability mean? Well, sustainable development, as defined by the World Commission on Environment and Development in their 1987 report, is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So at the heart of sustainable development lies a tension between innovation and the equitable distribution of resources across society from one generation to the next. And determining what an equitable distribution of resources amounts to in the context of sustainable ML is a matter of ethics. So broadly speaking, equity requires a fair distribution of burdens and benefits. And unlike the principle of equality, equity doesn't mean that everyone has to share exactly the same benefits and burdens, as it's possible that a fair distribution might entail that some individuals get a larger share and others get a smaller one. Now, sustainable development calls for an equitable distribution of resources in two different ways. The first is intergenerational justice, where resources are going to be shared across a society. For instance, making sure that people have access to hardware and educational resources to build their own TinyML devices, like this workshop's doing, that the benefits of this technology are widely enjoyed and the burdens don't disproportionately impact one community. Sustainable development also calls for intergenerational justice, where resources are going to be shared between the present generation and future ones. So if the raw materials for producing MCUs are depleted by the present generation, might make it impossible for future generations to meet their own needs, and this wouldn't be considered sustainable development. So a big part of sustainability is considering what moral obligations we might have to people who might not even exist yet. So as an old Greek proverb states, a society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they will never sit. So just to briefly mention, there is some optimism to be had here as well. There's been some really promising developments in industry. Here's just an example of a few sustainability pledges that some major companies have made. And if you're looking to think about like, how can I incorporate sustainable development into your TinyML projects, the good news is there's also some really helpful tools and information that are available and free to use. And I expect that more is on the way. So one cool tool you can check out is Microsoft Sustainability Calculator, which provides transparency into your carbon footprint associated with Dynamics 365 and Azure cloud usage. So in the bottom left-hand corner on the dashboard pictured on the slide, you'll see an example of a decreasing carbon emission between 2017 and 2020. And the graph immediately to the right of this shows carbon emissions have decreased, even though the cloud usage has increased. So by tracking of that, the actual and the avoided emissions over time, I think this information makes it a lot easier to make decisions that support more sustainable development. So while there's no one-size-fits-all strategy, factoring in the environmental impact about which cloud platform to use, which manufacturer to purchase hardware from, all of these things can really make a big difference, especially when you start looking to scale out your TinyML solutions. So now that we've covered some examples of ethical issues that might arise at each stage of the ML workflow, one thing that should be clear is that AI is a science and an art form in a sense, and there's really no substitute for critical thinking. So if we want to build AI responsibly, we need to view our task as involving more than just the mathematical or technical stuff. We also have to think about it as involving social, political, and ethical elements. So just to recap the goals of embedding ethics throughout the life cycle, you first want to be able to diagnose and identify ethical challenges as they arise. And as you gain familiarity with what types of problems there are, it'll be easier to spot them in your own work. And ethical concepts can be thought of as like tools that can help you gain traction on the problem. The second goal requires us to take things a step further. So instead of just saying what might be problematic about AI, turning this into some informed decisions about design and development. And lastly, being able to defend those design choices you make, to justify them. And you can think of this as like showing your moral math, so to speak, because there isn't always a clear answer. And sometimes there's going to be opposing views within the developing team about what to do. And so showing your moral math can be essential for communicating with other people and reaching consensus. So in closing, responsible AI can't really be satisfied with a checklist. It's an iterative process where we continually reflect and revise our work to make sure it stays aligned with human values. And this can certainly be a challenging process. There might not always be a clear answer about the best way to proceed, but I hope you'll be able to take away some new tools and ideas and ethical concepts from today's presentation to help you in your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Super interesting presentation. Let me clap here. And so let's see if there's any questions for you. So while participants think about questions, we had some presentation yesterday. I mean, Segun gave one about a project he's working on in Nigeria. And it was a picture about a community that shared like a drone that used or will use, TinyML to take pictures of, birds to optimize crop production. And there were many questions in the group about how the community was involved. But okay, Jonathan has a question. Jonathan, please.
Yes, earlier you were talking about the biases and stuff that appeared in models. If those are biases in the training data, is it possible that just reflects our own people's own biases that they aren't aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it can reflect both the biases of the people that are working, just because we might have blind spots. I think all humans are fallible in that respect, but also just like you might have data that perfectly represents the world, but the problem is we don't want to recreate the world that we currently live in. We want to make it better. And so this creates a real tension. And I think one thing that puts pressure on this problem is that there is a lot of data that's been collected. And I think sometimes what happens is there will be a company, right, and like, well, we have all of this data and we want to build an AI solution. So here you go, like make something of this. And I'm not sure if that's always the best way to think about collecting a data set and building AI from it. Instead, you might want to have an idea of what kind of AI solution you're trying to build and then set out to collect the data, because you can already kind of set some guidelines about like, okay, what kinds of issues might we expect? And it's a lot harder sometimes to go back and fix a problematic data set than it is to be able to collect one at the outset where you have an idea of what some of those concerns might be. So yeah, absolutely. This idea of like automating or, you know, perpetuating the kinds of biases or problems that we see in the world is definitely a real one and one of the major sources of bias when we're talking about AI.
Excellent. Any other questions? Segun, you had some comments about the community you were working with in Nigeria, and there were questions yesterday about the how they were involved in the project. Were they involved in the first place, or how would they get, you know, a benefit from the TinyML project?
Okay. In fact, I am so happy with Susan, this kind of presentation. I remember back, because the project started back in 2015. And when we did this, at a point, we didn't involve the community, we didn't involve several people. It's just our group. And we thought this should be best solutions. And at a point when we started deploying, we found out that we've missed out key people, which are those people that should be involved from the onset. And that was why when we started this project this year all over again, we try as much as possible to carry them along and involve them so that some of these key issues we'll be able to factor it into our design and make it more robust. And this is what we discovered over the years. Not involving them from the onset, many a times you leave out some very important information. And by the time you deploy, you find out that it's not useful to the community or to the people which you are developing it for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like you've learned that lesson the hard way, maybe in the first time of doing it. And I agree. I think that's just so important, because even just thinking about implementation, like there's a lot of hurdles to, like, maybe you've created something that works, but do people want it and are they going to use it? And maybe that's something, unless you're thinking about it from the outset of the project, you only learn this later on when it's like more of a major disappointment. Because at least when you, and I think like that's awesome that you've been incorporating the community now in the second project, because like you get to actually tackle those problems head on when there's still something you can do about it and factor it into decisions you're making as you go through the workflow. So that sounds really awesome.
There's a question in the chat from Endris saying, where does the bias come from? Is it in the algorithm or in the data?
It can be both, although I think what I focused on was mostly the problems with the data, because I think there's so many ways in which the data can end up being problematic that's really the one to kind of focus on, because I think most people are surprised to learn about things like measurement distortion, for instance. It wouldn't be something that's immediately obvious. That's like, oh, well, you know, we have data from this collected with this type of hardware. We're hoping to deploy something on a different type of hardware. All of a sudden, the model doesn't seem to be generating good results. So I think that was the one I wanted to focus on in the presentation, just in terms of like, here's all of the ways that the data might be problematic, because it really is like the bread and butter of machine learning. And so putting thought and care into the kinds of data that you're collecting, making sure you have some kind of gold standard for labeling it, overviewing, and those parts of the process really makes a huge difference. And I think like counteracts some of the problems head on, so you can stave those off for a little while.
Victor has a question.
Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice presentation from Susan. Okay. But you brought out something from like a conflictual matrix, like a type 1 error and type 2 error. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. So, and my question generally, my question therefore is that because type 1 error or type 2 error usually come from data imbalance problem. So my question is, are we at the stage, or what stage are we?
At like what stage would you be considering those questions about type 1 and type 2 errors?
I think we lost Victor. Victor, are you still there? No. Okay. So let's. Okay, Ritis, if you have a question, and if Victor comes back, then he can complete his question for Susan. Ritis, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Very low.
Do you hear me better?
Yes,
Yes.
much better now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for it. I about animal world. So suppose if I would be interested in collecting animal data, images or sounds, what kind of ethical issues, if any, I should be concerned about or looking into?
Right, that's a great question, because I think, especially this week, there's been so many awesome presentations and discussions of projects that are focusing on maybe wildlife conservation. And what's interesting about that is, like, you might think, well, do I really need to think about privacy when it comes to collecting data about animals? Maybe privacy seems like something that's more relevant when you're dealing with applications that deal with data from human beings. But actually, I think privacy and security issues are also still important when you're even doing projects that focus on animals. So for instance, one of the projects I think for later today that someone will talk about is an anti-poaching device. You can start to see how privacy and security will end up being especially relevant there too, just maybe in a different way than a human-facing application, or one that focuses on as humans as the subjects. Because when you think about that data, there's a lot of power that lies in that data. If your goal is to stop poaching, well, then you really want to make sure that people aren't gaining inappropriate access to the data, because then you might just be giving poachers like direct access to where to find these animals. And so that's why I think like the ethical things can sometimes be a little sneaky, right? Because I think it would be totally reasonable if someone thought about a product that was focused on working with animals, and then thinks, okay, so privacy isn't that much of an issue. It'll just, I think, be a little bit different how you think about the privacy issues. So there it'll be more closely connected to security concerns, making sure people don't have inappropriate access to that data, because you want to make sure if you're trying to prevent poaching, you're not letting that data somehow find its way into the hands of the poachers. So privacy is still relevant, it just takes a different kind of shape or character.
I have a hypothetical case I'd like to submit, if I may. Suppose, would there be any ethical type of issues if I had in mind an application in wildlife conservation, but I asked for data from the hunters? Because sometimes hunters, you know, they hang webcams just for their purposes in the forests and fields.
Yeah, so I guess you might still even worry about issues of bias there in terms of how representative is that data that you're getting from those hunters of the actual world, because it might turn out that like they're focused, the reasons and purposes and motivations for their data collection might end up being a little bit different than yours. And so you feel like, okay, so I'm getting, cool, this is like easy access to maybe get some data about these animals I'm trying to assist. And it turns out that they're only covering particular regions or,
But from the
Yes,
ethical
that becomes-
point of view, is there any conflict that you can see? I mean, technically, I don't see that being a problem because, whether you are environmentalist, or you are a hunter, you're still going to put up a camera somewhere. So there's no problem.
Oh, just in terms of like, maybe you have the aim of like helping the animals and you're getting the data from people who are killing the animals.
Something like that, yeah.
So I don't know if that would necessarily be the way I would like think about the ethical problem. Like just in itself, I don't think that's necessarily a problem if that's where you're obtaining the data from. Although it is interesting that you have very different ends, I guess, that seem to be in conflict. So, if the people who are sharing that data were aware of the purposes for which you were collecting it, would they still
For
want to share
example,
it
yes,
with you?
exactly.
Yeah, and so in that case, I think, if you can get them to share it with you, then that would be great. But it would still be important, I think, to at least inform those people of like your purposes for collecting the data and make sure that they're also consenting to the release of it. But if you can do that, then like, I think that's great to have an additional resource, although I would worry about maybe having that just be the entirety of where you're getting your data from. Like it might be a nice part to create a data set, but you might want to look towards other sources and think about making sure like you're actually getting a full picture of this animal.
Yeah, I meant the data set collection phase.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
We have two more questions. One from Timothy. Please, Timothy.
Okay. Mine is more of not of a question, but I'm going to share my experiences that in the data collection for the foot and mouth disease project, realized that the data sets are, like I said yesterday, that they are very scarce. So I had to sign some agreement with the University of Zimbabwe for me to be able to visit their farm so that I can be able to take pictures of their cattle. At the same time with the Prabright in the UK, they provided pictures, but there were some conditions that if you are to use these images, you're supposed to use them for academics, not for profit making, some clauses that you are supposed to follow. Because you realize that some countries, they don't put the images of foot and mouth because once a country has got foot and mouth, they'll be banned of trading beef. So those images, they are very scarce. So the only option was to have some agreement with Prabright and the investors. But of course, you cannot just take a cattle that is like a stray cattle, then just start to take pictures without the consent of the owner. I think is the issue of that kind of ethical behavior. That regardless that you can take the pictures, but you need to have the consent of the owner. I think so.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, so definitely in cases of agriculture, it's like, yeah, so technically like someone is supposed to speak for these cattle that you're trying to obtain the pictures from. And I think that's a great example of like these kinds of unforeseen issues, right? Like people, it's hard to find this kind of data because it has very serious implications for people's ability to trade and participate in that. So thank you for sharing. I mean, I think it's great experience. I think people can learn from.
We have Prof. Olabode, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. My question is very simple. I have I'm working on a project that involves chest X-rays of patients with COVID-19. So if I want to collect data on these patients, what should be my ethical considerations?
Oh, geez, I don't know. Do we have enough time to go through it? So I think once you start collecting data and it's specifically involving human participants, that's where more and more sort of like ethical questions about privacy and informed consent start to be raised. So I don't know where to even start, I guess, in terms of what kinds of questions you might want to ask. So the data you were collecting, I heard the part about it being from COVID-19 patients, but what was the particular type of data you were collecting?
Chest X-ray.
Oh, chest X-rays. Yeah. So what's fascinating about that is, so one thing is potential issues of like proxy bias or the AI being able to pick up on information that we might as humans be able to see from X-rays. So there was a few interesting papers showing that AI was actually able to predict someone's race or gender on the basis of an X-ray. And humans can't do that. Like we see an X-ray and it's an X-ray, right? But so there's even questions that you think might be like, oh, okay, so I don't have to worry about these kinds of sensitive attributes of the data because I can just exclude that, right? I just won't tell the AI whether this came from a man or a woman or what race they were. But it turns out that sometimes the AI is like so powerful that it can pick up on these kinds of patterns and with pretty good accuracy be able to predict whether an X-ray came from a particular individual. So I think when it comes to X-rays, especially because any kind of medical data is kind of at the top of the food chain in terms of how sensitive it is and how careful you have to be with it. And now that we're having these studies come out that it's like, oh, and by the way, like AI can also predict these kinds of things, I think that would be at least from the top of my mind, like an interesting concern that you might want to keep a lookout for. But yeah, definitely with sensitive information like X-rays, even if it doesn't seem like it has the same kinds of identifying features as other types of data, I would still by default try and treat it as if it did. Always try and have the utmost care with those kinds of things, because sometimes we end up being surprised about what kinds of sensitive attributes AI can pick up on.
There's, many questions in the chat, Susan. It's really, really interesting. So there was one question about legislation, which I think is really interesting. So someone was asking if, there's different legislations in different countries, and yeah, if you can.
Yeah. Yes, there is. And that is part of what makes this all so messy. And especially with something like AI, because it might be the case that you're collecting data from one country, but you're using a cloud service that's hosted in a different place. So you might not even just be involving the regulations with one country, but multiple, depending on like where different parts of your project end up ultimately taking place. And I think this is one thing that causes quite a bit of frustration for people who are working on AI projects, is figuring out how to navigate this, because we have not yet reached a point where we have kind of like worldwide policies and regulations about AI, and they can actually differ quite dramatically in terms of how stringent they are, what the expectations are. And so this is something that I think poses a serious challenge. And so it can be helpful sometimes to consult with someone who's an expert in the legal or regulatory world for AI issues. And I guess one other thing I'll add is, so yes, there are different regulations based on different countries. But another thing that makes this challenging is just how quickly those regulations and laws are developing now, because I think AI has been around for a while now, but it's kind of exploding and taking a place, front and center. It's under intense scrutiny because people are realizing like, wow, so this is really powerful, but we also want to be really careful with it. So the law and regulations have kind of followed in the footsteps of AI innovation. And so now it's kind of in this reactive mode where it's trying to get caught up on the ways in which AI has developed so far. So the reason I bring this up is because I think what we're seeing is that legislation and regulations can be developing very quickly. And so sometimes this puts you in a predicament as someone who's working on research or developing a project, because you're like, well, this is what the legislation says today, but what's it going to say tomorrow? So that's why I think one thing that can be really useful is having some kind of understanding for yourself or the people that you're working with on this project, to at least try and keep an eye out for potential developments in regulations, because I think you will hear people talking about things that might be anticipated. And depending on how long a project is expected to take to completion, it's always good to like have the eye towards like, oh, okay, well, in 6 months, I know that this is probably going to be a new regulation about data sharing, for instance, in which case, like, it's nice to be able to try and anticipate some of those things and make sure that your project fits in line with the most stringent regulation, just because kind of puts you in the clear going forward. And I realize that might like impose some extra burdens on developing the project where you're like, well, I thought I was going to be able to do this, and I can technically right now, but I know in 6 months they're going to change this. So sometimes it requires kind of pivoting your research or plans that you have.
Endries had a very interesting question. So it says that in academia, very often we do data augmentation because data sets are small in size. And so would that kind of, multiply the bias or, keep the bias at the same level as the original data set?
So the question is about having like a smaller data set as opposed to a big one?
No, having a small data set and then using this data augmentation. So artificially making it bigger so that you have more data for your model. But then if you have a bias in then if you have a bias in the small data, do you have it in the big data?
Yeah, so I think yes. So I think there's some benefits to synthetic data where it can help you like increase the size of a data set, right? Add some variables in there, but it doesn't necessarily address what might be some of the root issues in the data that it's being based off of. Because even when you have something like synthetic data, it's not just being made up, it's being based off of the data that you presently do have. And so while it might be trying to adjust some things and it looks different from the original data, that's not to say that it's completely eradicating those issues of bias. And that's why I think often when I talk about issues of bias, I think the goal is mitigation, not like fixing it, because I think fixing it suggests like, okay, so we just do this one thing and then it's like done. We don't have to worry about it anymore. But I think really what the striving for is like just to mitigate it, to know that it's a problem and do what we can to address it with this understanding that it's like, it's really hard and data can be biased in so many ways. So it might not be the case that you have like a perfectly unbiased data set. I'm not even sure what that would look like, to be honest. I think that would be a really tall order to fill. But so yes, to answer your question, I think synthetic data has a lot of benefits, but one of my worries is when people think that it's kind of like, okay, so then we don't have to worry so much about issues of bias, or like it's addressing this one problem. In some ways, it can actually function to perpetuate bias in some ways and make it a little bit more difficult to track.
Okay, super. I think we're on the hour, so I just have one comment. It's not a question, but it's a comment. So today we did a keyword spotting, and we used a data set about yes and no, or we did our own data set, but we could use this open data set that had these two words, yes and no. And that's interesting because it's in English, right? So we give for granted that people will use English, but that's not the case for the majority of participants in the workshop, right? We have so many dialects, and 20 African countries speak French. And I think tomorrow we're going to have a case study from UNESCO about an emergency system that was developed for East Africa, but only worked in English on a mobile phone. And that actually didn't work for a local population because they would speak, dialect. So I think that even, the kind of the language bias, is there, and we should really, keep that in mind, especially for our TinyML application that, very often use keyword spotting. Super. So thank you again, Susan. That was wonderful and very, very interesting. We have a Discord channel. I will send you the link if you have any time. People might have more questions, or I will send you the questions. And again, thank you so much, and see you all tomorrow.